right? So to the north of the church is the residential area. We have the abbot's house having direct access to the crossing and transept. We have guest house for those traveling monks. And we have residential area for other priests and monks, right? So the north part is basically the residential area. There's a kind of vegetable garden. There are animal pens, so they can raise their own pig and goat. There are workshops, and they can make their own tool. They not only make tools for themselves, and later they even sell their tools. They were so good at it. So the church also became some kind of industrial center in some areas. And on the east side, just behind the apse, is the kind of a, there's a cemetery located there, of course, closer to Easter for the rebirth. And that is located in that area. So here, basically what we are looking at is a self-sufficient society where you don't need to leave the monastery to spend your entire life, right? And the church has a unique character. So we have the basilica in the middle, but then attached to it, there is a cloister. Cloister is a peristyle courtyard with a garden in the center and surrounded by the church and the chapter house, as well as the refectory. Refectory is basically the dining hall, right? So it's surrounded by those buildings. There's a courtyard serving as a metaphor for the paradise, for people to meditate. And then the chapter house, people can have a study, reading a chapter. And then it is also next to the church. It is next to the dining facility. So there's this kind of internal garden located at the heart of the whole monastery. So something like this might have never been actually built completely, but it certainly provided a model for the construction of monastery, especially for the order. For example, the Franciscan order of building a lot of monasteries. So so in the 11th century to the 13th century, there were two kind of major orders. In the beginning, there was just the Franciscan, and later it kind of split into more orders, more, as the monasticism developed all over Europe. Naturally, those regional variation were established. So there were kind of different different orders in the monastic practice. And the two influential ones are the Cluniac order and the Cistercian order. And they have different philosophy for architecture and different philosophy for life and different approaches for architecture. The Cluniac order celebrate the glory of the Lord with luxurious, beautifully decorated architecture. So they featured a life of elaborate communal worship, having those great ceremonies, fantastic festivals and display, and of those liturgical splendor. And they also emphasize the worldly magnificence in their architecture. So their architecture tended to be ornate, and they believe those ornate architecture and wonderful architecture was a praise and a celebration of the religion, and was great gift Lord. While the Cistercian order had a totally opposite attitude toward architecture and a philosophy of life, they believe they kind of inherited the original drive for the development of monasticism. They celebrate the life of austerity, and the belief that manual labor and self-denial with sparse, undecorated architecture as a virtue. They also believe that the physical hardship in labor, in actual manual work, was a good training and good practice to achieve great high spirituality. And their architecture is austere, just like their life, and usually undecorated, very simplistic. So that's this huge contrast between the two approaches in architecture. There are not that many monasteries survived from the Cluniac order, partially because of the emphasis on luxury and grandeur, push them to follow, the fashion in architecture as well as in lifestyle. So a lot of those Cluniac monasteries were later reconstructed in the Gothic fashion, when Gothic became the new fashion in the 13th century. So there were not that many complete monasteries survived from the Cluniac order. But one kind of cloister from France is from that order. The rest of the monastery had been heavily reconstructed in the Gothic fashion, but that cloister, the southern attachment, the courtyard, the garden attached to the basilica, survived from the 12th century. It features 76 capitals and 8 piers, each with a different theme based on biblical, evangelical, and fantastical subject. So each one display those fantastic animal figure and floral vegetal figures ornately carved with saint and human figures carved on the piers and capital as well. But it's a fragmented memory from the 12th century in the large monastery, and that was criticized by Saint Bernard. Saint Bernard was the founder of the Cistercian order. He said, quote, "Those fierce lines, those monstrous centers, for God's sake, if men are not ashamed of these follies, why at least do they not shrink from the expense?" So these were obviously very costly and require a lot of money and human labor. And that also testified to the great wealth accumulated by the church in the medieval period. So Cistercian monastery survived better because they tended to emphasize simplicity. So they were not tracing the fashion, and they were not as reconstructed. They were not reconstructed as frequently as the Cluniac order. So the monastery at Fontenay, also in France, from the 12th century, had survived almost completely. So not just a cloister, but also the entire church, the refectory, and the chapter house, and as well as some workshop. So they exemplify the life of simplicity and self-denial as championed by St. Bernard. And the monastery was also established in the rugged, unpopulated, inhospitable regions for a lifestyle of self-denial. And so here we have another quote from St. Bernard. He criticized again for example, the Clunic order for not clothing their son, but clothing their stone, right? So clothe their stone in gold and leaves her sons naked. While the Cistercian monastery, their architecture can be considered naked, right? So hopefully they helped to clothe the people better. So this is the interior of the Church of Fontenay, and there's no decoration. The interior is just as simplistic as exterior. We know that even from the early Christian church, the interior was quite ornate, but here it is the opposite, right? So I will go faster for this example. I think I don't need to speak too much. Everyone can see the architecture here. No decoration, just simple gabled house, and you can see clearly the interior, right? So like here, this is the nave, and that's the aisle, and the interior spatial arrangement was expressed clearly and simplistically on the exterior. So they have bare walls, simple forms, and clear proportions, but they also incorporated those ideal proportion, which does not cost anything. In this case, they use the ratio of 1:2, which is suggested by St. Augustine in his famous description of ideal city for the Lord's kingdom, and using those ideal proportion. And in this case, it is reflecting the heavenly order, not as in the classical case, representing the human, perfect human body. And so here we have the church. The facade is very plain, and the central higher nave and the side aisle, right, expressed just frankly on the facade. The central entrance. Dormitory located above the chapter house. So that there we have the chapter house, and the second stories provide the bedroom for the practitioner. And here we have the dining facility. And this is a water-powered forge. I mentioned that those monasteries were also the heart for technical innovation. They produced tools for agriculture. And here, the monks invented the hydraulic hammer, which was the basis for future industrial revolution. And so the church remained a very important center for education, for technical innovation, and for kind of new fashions in architecture as well during the medieval period. But this utilitarian building is just as simple and as ornate as the church itself, which reflect the philosophy of the Cistercian order, of course, right? So now let's take a look at a different type of cathedral and church, and that is the pilgrim, right? We talk about the two tendency, monasticism and pilgrimage. Well, the body of Apostle St. James was miraculously discovered in 813 at Compostela in Galicia, in Spain. It's here, right? So that attracted movement of pilgrims to this location. It became a destination for mass pilgrim. Journey took up to 16 weeks from all over Europe, especially from France. So there were different routes. And along those routes, commerce flourished. And at those strategic location, great wealth accumulated, and churches were built to provide hospitality for pilgrims. And they became the new nucleus for, or new nucleus for urbanism. And the pilgrimage church built were very different from the monastic church. They were usually independent, not attached to other facilities, not attached to a cloister, for example, or other dining facility. They are usually a freestanding monument. And secondly, they created a layout that is utterly different from the monastic monastery. So let's take a look at the Church of Sainte-Foy in Conques in France. So that is one of the pilgrimage church. It is located on the route of pilgrims to St. Compostela in Spain. So it has a layout with aisles connected with a ambulatory. That's a characteristic and an innovation made by the pilgrimage church. Because this church were not only serving a internal local community, but serving a lot of people coming from a distant world on their way to a major pilgrimage site. And a lot of these churches were themselves pilgrimage site. Well, they were smaller pilgrimage site. And a lot of them also claim that they own relics from a saint. So the apse radiate out smaller chapels. And those chapels were the place where the relics of saint were on display. So that connection of the aisle with the ambulatory allowed the pilgrims to go around the central nave and go to the back to have more private interaction with the sacred objects there without disturbing the ceremonies happening in the nave. While the nave can continuously being used for to serve the local community for mass, and those pilgrims can go around and going to the back. So the original functional division between the nave and aisle from early Christian period was changed. In the beginning, they were meant for the fully baptized in the nave and uninitiated in the aisle. But for the pilgrimage church, the function were divided. You know, the nave were for ceremonies of local community, and then the aisle serving those pilgrims who mainly come here to take a look or to be cured by the relics housed now in those chapels radiating from the apse. So the Latin cross shape remained, and the altar area now is within the ambulatory. And then the choir is located around the crossing. So that became a standard cathedral plan. So Church of Sainte-Foy features a massive and thick stone masonry wall to support the weight of the vault. It is constructed in masonry. It used geometric arch and vault, and thus became known as Romanesque because they were constructed in the fashion like the Romans. So the interior, Centerfoy use barrel vault for the nave, right? So the nave has simple barrel vault, and the aisle use groin vault, right? The aisle, and the crossing naturally features a central domical structure because there the two barrel vault meet, and so instead of just building a groin vault there, the groin vault would just cover the space without any light. So to elevate the roof, here the squinch was used, and the squinch is a popular structural method used in Islamic architecture, but here it is used to in a Christian church, which is not very common, because usually it is using pendentive in the Christian case. But here, the square was first transformed into octagon, and then a domical roof was covered on top of it, high above the nave, so that clerestory windows can be opened. So there we are looking at that location. That is the place of the crossing where light come down, right? And the side of the nave was divided into two layers, right? So there's a lower aisle space, and there's a upper kind of galleries, and those are usually reserved for women. Now the women use upper level above the aisle, and the lower level of the aisle can be used as for transportation purposes for those pilgrims to go undisturbingly to the back of the nave to admire the relics. So at Centerfoy, he also use proportion 1:2 and 1:1, right? So basically, there's the use of module of the side aisle bay, and the nave has a 1:2 proportion, and the side has 1:1, and the crossing is also 1:1. So they use that ideal number, just like in the Cistercian monastery of Fontenay. And they also alternate a square pier with a circular pier to create a proportion of 1:1 as well. Because otherwise you feel this is a unit. However, since every other column is a square or circle, so you can also imagine this as one unit, and that proportion is 1:1, right? So this is a section of Centerfoy, a Romanesque church, the section, the gallery, the aisle, the nave, and barrel vault for the nave, and a groin vault for the aisle. The gallery about the aisle, by the way, is also known as the tribune, right? So that space, and this is a new development of these pilgrimage church, who needs to accommodate more complicated function. So that space was explored above the aisle, because the aisle now needed to be dedicated to a different function. This is the crossing. See that transition using basically squinch. And the facade, very simplistic, but this would be known as westwork because all these major cathedrals are entered from the west side. So the western facade is the major facade. The westwork referred to the western facade of a cathedral or a church. And eventually it would become the most ornate part in Gothic architecture. Now, Romanesque is just one step further toward Gothic. It already had a lot of characteristic of Gothic church, including using ribs to construct a vault. But Romanesque church in general has greater variety compared to the later Gothic church, which can be considered, international, because Gothic became much more uniform and also much more influential. So Romanesque church, they have their consistent characteristic of using geometric shape, using semicircle, using dome, using geometric arch. But some of them, use barrel vault. Some of them use groin vault. This one use groin vault in their nave, and some use dome for their nave. So each bay of their the nave is capped with a dome, and some use transverse barrel vault. That one, the barrel vault is going along the axis, but this one, the barrel goes in the crossing direction, right? So they have different way of dividing interior. And the facade, their westwork, or in the German term, Westwerk, are also quite diversified. So this is the westwork of a Romanesque in Italy, here in Germany, and in France, and in England. So they have great diversity. But they have one consistency, that is using geometric arch and vault, right? And they remind people the great ability of the Romans, and they use pure masonry structure for both the roof and the wall, and they became known as Romanesque. Romanesque was very popular in the 12th century throughout Europe with greater regional diversity. While Gothic, when Gothic arrived, it created a uniform style that was popularized throughout Europe. Now the comparison between, contrast between Romanesque and Gothic. In the interior, clearly one used semicircular geometric arch, another used pointed vault. Gothic church also highlighted the skeleton of the building, used more ribs. So here we only have, fewer ribs, and thus the wall of the ceiling and the wall as well cannot be very thin. But Gothic architecture used more skeleton, used more ribs, and thus the roof can be lighter, and a bigger window can be opened on the wall. So the first great contrast is pointed vault versus geometric vault, and secondly, large area of the wall in contrast to the massive wall. So Romanesque is more closed up, but Gothic church is very bright. It reduced the structural element to skeleton, and the whole wall became glassy, became window. And the second contrast is size, right? Gothic church is usually much bigger. So these two were drawn to the same scale. Notre Dame de Chartres in France, and the previous example of Santa Foy, Romanesque church. So you can fit a few Romanesque church inside the nave of a Gothic church. Gothic church are big. And the wall, windows replace those massive wall. But other than that, the spatial arrangement basically continue from the Romanesque. So it was a new development from the Romanesque church. Now, from exterior, the verticality was more emphasized in Gothic, while in Romanesque church, vertical towers were constructed. However, in the Gothic church, that verticality was explored, not only expressed on the big tower on the westwork, but also in every detail. So you find those vertical motifs everywhere. So that verticality soaring toward heaven, that emphasis was highlighted and most powerfully expressed in Gothic architecture. The beginning of Gothic was in the mid-12th century, started with Abbot Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis. Saint-Denis Church was the patron church for the king of France. The kings were buried in the church crypt underneath. And in the mid-12th century, Abbot Suger reconstructed the apse into a new fashion. And he was very self-conscious about what he wanted to create. He said, quote here, "The entire sanctuary is thus pervaded by a wonderful and a continuous light entering through the most sacred windows." So he wanted to make a metaphor that Jesus Christ was like the light that illuminate the world and create the sacred space. So the reconstruction reduced the wall to several kind of piers using skeletal ribs to support the roof, and opened the wall to be covered by stained glass window. And those colorful stained glass window during the daytime, when they were illuminated by the sunshine from outside, created those beautiful image that can be appreciated from the inside. And so the patron deity of Saint-Denis for the church was often confused with the Neoplatonic philosopher Denis. And coincidentally, the philosopher Denis also espoused the doctrine of Christ as the true light. So this is a different Denis as the patron deity of Denis, to which the church was dedicated. But probably the philosophy of Denis that compare Christ as a true light has inspired Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis, to come up with the idea of featuring light for the new construction of the ambulatory and the apse area, right? So that might be a happy coincidence or a happy confusion. Anyway, a new style was born, with very self-consciousness about making a metaphor of Jesus Christ as the light to illuminate the world. So that was done thanks to the new structural method of using more ribs to sustain the roof, so that the roof can be reduced to a membrane. And in Saint Denis, the rest of the building were still pretty much Romanesque, but the eastern end started a new fashion. And very quickly, other church started to follow, because it created such a miraculous interior experience for the believers. So Gothic church also became a powerful expression of civic pride. Each city compete with their neighbor to construct the tallest and the greatest Gothic church, and they invested their wealth and labor to build their church. And those church represent the identity of the cities, and a lot of those cities were free cities, no longer tied to a fiefdom. So Gothic church also became the new voice. It was religious, however, it was also representing civic pride of the new tendency for independency of those cities. So from the mid 12th century to the mid 13th century, churches just kept breaking record for their height and for their scale. So from the 80 feet nave height to 157 height. So the rise in scale. They might look very similar in the picture, but you should be aware their actual scale are quite different. And you can tell that by looking at the scale of the seat. So this one is smaller because their seat looks so big, and this one is much bigger. You can barely see their seat. So even though they might look similar in picture, you have to go to experience them to get a sense of their scale. Now, our major example for Gothic church is the Chartres Cathedral, just in the suburb of Paris. It was built between 1194 and 1260. And the cathedral had the characteristic Gothic plan with a nave and a aisle connected with ambulatory. And Chartres Cathedral had a double ambulatory. And these ambulatory were tied with these small chapels for displaying relics. And in the plan, you can see the load-bearing element were reduced to dots, and they use vault, groin vault primarily, but those vault were reduced to ribs, and the vaults were reduced to very thin membrane. The Church of Chartres was developed from a Romanesque church, right? Chartres was the pilgrimage destination of the cult of Virgin Mary. And it claimed that it held the original tunic that Mary wore at nativity giving birth, right? So this is a very significant relics, the tunic. In 1130s, a new facade was built to extend the nave And then in 1194, a fire burned the cathedral. So originally they were just meant to extend the nave of the original cathedral and to give it a grander facade. But then after half a century during the construction, well, it is very common for the construction of a Gothic cathedral or Romanesque cathedral over multi centuries. You first complete the center, the altar area, and then build bay after bay over many generations. So the extension of the nave and giving new facade was very common because a cathedral was not completed during one's lifetime. It is a century-long project. But during that reconstruction, a fire broke out, burned the old part. But miraculously, the tunic was undamaged. So the building was burned, but not the relics. That was interpreted as if Mary wanted a more splendid church. So in another word, Mary wanted not only the extension of the nave following the Romanesque fashion, but a total reconstruction of the apse area following the new Gothic fashion. And that is what it was done, starting in the late 12th century. So the apse was also reconstructed following the new Gothic fashion. The construction of the new church was sponsored by the bishop of Chartres chapter, the king, and the count of Chartres, a local noble. The merchant class and crafts guilds also form a partnership. They also contributed to the construction. So the construction was not only limited to the nobility, but the entire citizenship of Chartres. So each of those guilds also were acknowledged. So here, for example, this stained glass features a stonemason who is carving a marble. And that is acknowledging the contribution of the stonemason crafts and their guild, their contribution to the church. So cathedral was also an expression of civil life and civic pride. It is religious, but it is also a collective effort to make the city great. So the metaphor of light from interior, you can see the light coming from outside to illuminate those rose window, famous rose window. From outside, it doesn't look that fantastic, but from inside with the light coming from outside, it really create a magical interior. You can actually still see the facade of Chartres of that half Romanesque. For example, the lower part still are using semicircular arches. This is the old Romanesque facade constructed before the burning of the eastern area. And after the burning of the eastern area, the apse, the whole cathedral was reconstructed. The apse was expanded, and the old facade was just constructed within the new Gothic fashion. And the upper windows are all constructed in pointed arch, pointed vault in the new Gothic fashion, right? And the two towers were also completed in a two period that is separated by more than a century. So they have totally different style, right? So this is Gothic Cathedral. Their construction was an effort of a couple centuries. It's not completed within one's lifetime. And as a result, they became the major expression of a city, of a civic pride. There is no contemporary counterpart of architecture that is comparable to Gothic. Gothic Cathedral, it is constructed over many generations, and its great achievement can hardly be surpassed anymore in later history. And the rose window also became a metaphor for Mary. So Chartres Cathedral represent the great achievement of the French Gothic, and it is archetypal architecture of French Gothic style that eventually influenced the whole Europe and the whole world. So I'm just, for the rest of few slides, I'm going to go very quickly because we are already 7 minutes after our time. Ratio, ideal ratio still matters, right? In Gothic, ideal ratio. And ribs that reduce the roof into membrane to free the wall for light. And but to counterbalance those vault, flying buttresses were developed, right? Now the Gothic architect figured out you don't have to support the whole wall. You just need to support the weak point. And that is just at the base of the vault. So the other part can be free. So they created these flying buttresses. They created spaces under the inside the buttress and make those flying buttresses. And the supporting system also became skeletal. Not only the interior, but also the buttresses also became skeletal. And that is another characteristic of Gothic. And the construction, Gothic churches features double roof. There is an upper timber roof. There's a lower masonry roof. Now we are in between. We are looking down at the masonry roof for the nave, and above is the timber roof. They construct the outer roof first. So this part is first completed. And the lower masonry roof were actually constructed by hanging the stone from above, which is very understandable. Because imagine this is the height of more than 150 feet. You would need a lot of wood to create a centering for the construction of that vault from below. And the Gothic craftsmen were much more clever than that. Below, they constructed the above roof. They built the wall and the flying buttresses and built that part and hand the material down. So they save a lot of wood for the construction of that ceiling. This illustrates how they build their. All right. So the final summarization of the Gothic feature, and you can read this on your own. All right. And the great Gothic interior. So we are going to stop here. And I'm going to show you the following slide. You can pause the video. There are some variation in England, but pretty similar still to the French model, right? England model had more kind of horizontal division in the Gothic church rather than kind of vertical continuousness. right? Great comparison between the French model and the British model. You can see greater continuity of vertical line and the horizontality in the British model, and in this case, the Cathedral of Salisbury. And eventually, Gothic would become flamboyant, creating those so many ribs that were more decorative than structural, something we discussed in many other traditions, the Chinese brackets, as well as the Islamic muqarnas. So they experience the same path, evolving from a structural necessity into a decorative motif that combine structure and decoration seamlessly. I think we can stop there.